Nobody expected the moment to turn into a cultural earthquake. The interview was supposed to be routine. Another polished sports segment, another star athlete smiling through predictable questions about the future, endorsements, and the excitement of joining the professional stage. The lights were bright, the cameras were steady, and the host had already rehearsed the usual friendly script that athletes answer every single week. But Caitlin Clark didn't follow the script. When the host asked her about the transition into the league, what she expected, how she felt about the pressure, what it meant for the growth of women's basketball, everyone in the studio assumed the same safe response they'd heard from dozens of athletes before. Something polished. Something media-trained. Something harmless. Instead, Clark leaned forward slightly, paused for just a second, and asked a question that instantly changed the tone of the entire conversation. Why do people only respect women's basketball when it threatens men's comfort? The room froze. Not the dramatic kind of silence that television producers love to create. This was the kind of silence that happens when nobody expected honesty to hit that hard. The host blinked. The production crew looked up from their monitors. And somewhere across the country, NBA players scrolling through social media suddenly stopped mid-scroll. Because Clark didn't stop with that one sentence. She started talking about the double standards surrounding women's basketball. About the constant jokes, the dismissive memes, and the casual comments from people who had never watched a full game but somehow felt comfortable judging the entire sport. She talked about carrying record-breaking viewership numbers while still hearing that the competition wasn't real. She talked about how highlights of women's games were often treated like novelty clips instead of elite basketball. And then she dropped the line that truly detonated the internet. If some NBA players actually watched us hoop, they'd stop pretending they're above us. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Sports shows began replaying it on loop. Twitter erupted into debates that spread across millions of screens. Fans started arguing in comment sections. Podcasts rushed emergency episodes, and analysts suddenly realized the conversation around women's basketball had shifted overnight. But what most people watching that viral moment didn't realize was that Caitlin Clark hadn't suddenly decided to speak out. That moment had been building for months. Behind the scenes, long before that interview aired, something had been quietly unfolding inside the basketball world. A tension that had been growing between rising women's basketball stars and the culture surrounding the NBA. A tension fueled by jokes, comparisons, dismissive comments, and a level of disrespect that many players had learned to ignore. Clark had ignored it too. For a while. But as her popularity exploded and the spotlight on women's basketball grew brighter than ever before, the reactions from certain corners of the basketball world began to change. What started as small comments slowly turned into louder opinions. What once sounded like harmless jokes began to feel like something else entirely. And eventually, Caitlin Clark reached the point where staying quiet no longer made sense. The world saw the moment she spoke. What they didn't see was everything that pushed her there. Before the controversy, before the debates, before NBA players started responding on podcasts and social media, Caitlin Clark was already doing something that the basketball world hadn't seen in a very long time. She was changing the gravity of the sport. For years, women's basketball had incredible talent, passionate fan bases, and unforgettable players. Legends had built the foundation long before Clark ever stepped onto a college court. But what Clark brought with her was something slightly different. Something that felt almost electric every time she touched the ball. Range. Confidence. And the kind of fearless play that made people stop whatever they were doing just to watch the next possession. Suddenly, women's college basketball wasn't just being followed by dedicated fans of the sport. It was becoming appointment viewing. Arenas were selling out faster than expected. Ticket prices were climbing. Television networks that once struggled to pull strong ratings from women's games were suddenly reporting numbers that shocked executives behind the scenes. Entire broadcasts began revolving around one simple question. What would Caitlin Clark do next? She was pulling up from distances that most players wouldn't even consider attempting. Logo threes that felt reckless in theory but somehow looked completely natural when the ball left her hands. Passes that cut through defenses like lasers. Performances that stacked up points so quickly that scoreboards sometimes struggled to keep up. 40-point games stopped feeling rare. 30-foot shots stopped feeling surprising. And the crowds, both inside arenas and online, kept getting bigger. Networks noticed it immediately. Ratings for women's NCAA tournament games started climbing at a pace nobody had predicted. Some broadcasts began pulling numbers that rivaled major men's college matchups. Social media clips from Clark's games racked up millions of views in hours, sometimes faster than highlights from NBA games played the same night. Suddenly, the conversation inside sports media began shifting. Producers were asking new questions in editorial meetings. Should we lead the show with this highlight? Why are these clips outperforming our usual segments? How many viewers tuned in just to watch Clark play? For the first time in a long time, the spotlight on women's basketball wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. And with every massive performance, Clark's visibility exploded further. She wasn't just a great player anymore. She was becoming a cultural moment. Brands started calling. Sponsorship deals lined up. Cameras followed her from arenas to locker rooms to post-game interviews. Reporters began describing her as the most influential women's basketball star in years, maybe decades. But attention has a strange way of reshaping conversations. Because the more Clark dominated headlines, the more she began appearing in spaces where women's basketball had rarely been discussed before. NBA talk shows started mentioning her name. Sports podcasts debated her range compared to professional shooters. Fans began posting clips comparing her deep threes to some of the best long-range shooters in the NBA. At first, it felt like admiration. Then slowly, the tone started changing. What had begun as curiosity from NBA circles started turning into comparisons. Comparisons turned into debates. And debates, as they often do on the internet, began drifting into something sharper. Something more dismissive. Because in the same comment sections where fans celebrated Clark's performances, another type of response started appearing more frequently. Comments that sounded like praise, but weren't really praise at all. She's good for women's basketball. Looks impressive until you compare it to NBA defense. Put her in a real league and those shots disappear. Those kinds of lines started showing up everywhere. Under highlights. On podcasts. During sports talk shows. At first, they were scattered voices. But as Clark's popularity kept rising, the comments started getting louder. And eventually, they reached places that Clark herself couldn't ignore anymore. At first, the comments were easy to brush off. Every athlete who becomes visible enough eventually runs into criticism. It's part of the ecosystem of modern sports. The bigger the spotlight gets, the louder the opinions become. Clark understood that better than most. She had already spent years competing in packed arenas, hearing opposing fans yell from the stands, and seeing strangers debate her abilities online. So when the first wave of dismissive reactions started appearing, she treated them like background noise. A few jokes on sports podcasts. A couple of NBA players laughing during casual conversations about women's basketball. An analyst saying her deep shots look impressive because the defense is different. None of it seemed like a serious problem at first. Just the usual chatter that surrounds athletes whenever comparisons between leagues begin. But the internet has a way of repeating things until they start sounding like consensus. And slowly, the tone shifted. Clips of Clark hitting impossible threes would spread across social media, gathering millions of views in hours. Fans would celebrate the range, the confidence, the way she seemed completely unfazed by pressure. Then the replies would start. Nice shot, but she wouldn't get that off in the NBA. She's playing against college defenders. Looks easier when the athletes aren't as fast. Thousands of comments repeating the same idea in slightly different ways. Not outright attacks, but a constant suggestion that her achievements only mattered within a limited context. It wasn't just random fans either. Sports podcasts began bringing up her name during NBA discussions, sometimes in ways that sounded more dismissive than curious. A host might show one of her highlights and say something like, "She's clearly talented, but let's be realistic." Another would laugh and ask if people were seriously comparing those shots to what professional men were doing every night. Even some NBA players, during relaxed conversations on live streams or podcasts, would casually throw out remarks that quickly spread across the internet. Nothing aggressive enough to create headlines. Just enough to keep the narrative alive. She's nice. But let's not act like she's one of us. That phrase, one of us, started appearing more often. And every time it did, the internet grabbed it, clipped it, reposted it, and debated it for days. Meanwhile, Clark kept doing the same thing she had always done. Playing. Winning games. Breaking records. She didn't respond publicly to any of the comments. No tweets. No interviews pushing back. No subtle shots at critics. From the outside, it looked like she wasn't paying attention at all. But people close to her noticed something different. They noticed how often her teammates would show her things popping up online. They noticed how frequently reporters began asking questions about comparisons to men's basketball. They noticed the subtle change in her answers when the topic came up. Still calm, still respectful, but slightly more direct than before. Because Clark saw the comments. All of them. Every viral clip that came with a backhanded compliment. Every podcast moment where someone dismissed her range with a quick laugh. Every social media thread where strangers debated whether her success was real basketball or something easier. For months, she stayed quiet. She focused on the court. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. The more attention women's basketball received, the more some voices within the basketball world seemed uncomfortable with it. And eventually, the jokes stopped feeling harmless. They started feeling personal. For a while, the noise stayed in the background. Clark kept putting up numbers that felt almost unreal. Another 30-point game here. Another logo 3 there. Another arena filled with fans who came specifically to watch her play. The cycle repeated over and over again, and every time it did, the audience grew larger. But the louder the applause became, the louder the skepticism seemed to grow alongside it. What started as scattered comments from fans slowly started appearing in places that carried more weight. Podcasts hosted by current or former NBA players began discussing Clark's highlights with a tone that felt less curious and more dismissive. Clips of those conversations spread quickly online, sometimes getting millions of views before the players involved even realized how widely their words were circulating. One podcast episode in particular began making the rounds everywhere. During a casual segment, the hosts were reacting to a compilation of Clark's deep three-pointers. The shots were ridiculous. Pull-ups from distances that most players would hesitate to attempt even during practice. The crowd in the video was losing its mind every time the ball splashed through the net. But instead of admiration, the reaction in the studio was laughter. One of the players leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "She's good," he said, almost casually. "But let's be real. She's not doing that against real defenders." The other host chuckled and added, "People talking like she could step on an NBA floor. That's crazy." The clip lasted less than 20 seconds. But once it hit social media, it exploded. Fans began arguing instantly. Some defended the players, saying the comparison between leagues wasn't fair. Others called the comments disrespectful, pointing out that nobody was claiming Clark could compete in the NBA. They were simply celebrating her dominance in her own sport. But debates online rarely stay balanced. Soon the conversation turned into something else entirely. Every highlight of Clark started carrying the same argument underneath it. Some people praised her skill. Others repeated the same dismissive talking points from the podcast. And then something happened that made the situation impossible to ignore. A young NBA player, someone who had built a reputation online for being outspoken, decided to join the conversation. Instead of speaking on a podcast, he posted directly under one of Clark's viral highlight clips. "Relax," the comment read. She wouldn't last 5 minutes guarding NBA players. Within minutes, screenshots of the comment were everywhere. Fans reacted instantly. Some defended Clark, others piled on with jokes comparing men's and women's basketball. The comment section turned into a chaotic debate that stretched across thousands of replies. Clark didn't respond. Not publicly. But people close to her later said that was the moment everything changed. Because unlike random criticism from strangers online, this wasn't just another fan comment. This was a professional player, someone with a massive platform, openly dismissing her in front of millions of people. And it didn't stop there. Other clips started resurfacing. Older interviews. Podcast jokes. Casual remarks from players who had previously laughed about women's basketball. None of them seemed significant on their own, but when fans stitched them together, they created a pattern that suddenly felt much bigger. A pattern that suggested the quiet disrespect surrounding women's basketball wasn't just coming from internet trolls. It was coming from inside the basketball world itself. Clark still stayed silent. She didn't quote the comments. She didn't post a response. She didn't give the media the reaction they were hoping for. But she did something else. According to people close to her circle, she started saving the clips. Screenshots of comments. Links to podcasts. Moments where her name was used as the punchline of a joke. Not because she planned to attack anyone, but because she was starting to realize something important. The conversation around women's basketball wasn't just about talent anymore. It was about respect. And eventually, someone was going to have to say that out loud. Clark just didn't know yet that the moment would arrive on live television, in front of the entire sports world. The interview wasn't supposed to be memorable. It was scheduled like hundreds of other athlete appearances that happen every season. A quick sit-down segment, a few polished questions about the future, maybe a highlight replay or two, and then the athlete thanks the host and moves on to the next obligation on a packed media schedule. Clark had done interviews like this before. Plenty of them. By this point, she had already learned how the routine worked. Smile, stay respectful, talk about the team, talk about growth, thank the fans, and avoid saying anything that could become tomorrow's headline. But on that day, something felt different. Maybe it was the months of quiet criticism building in the background. Maybe it was the endless comparisons between her game and men's basketball. Or maybe it was simply the realization that no matter how many records she broke, the same dismissive tone kept showing up in conversations about her success. Whatever the reason was, Clark walked into that studio with a different kind of energy. The host started exactly the way producers expected. They talked about her rise, the packed arenas, the explosion of attention surrounding women's basketball. Clips of her deep three-pointers rolled across the screen while the audience applauded. Everything felt normal, almost predictable. Then the host asked the question that was meant to close the segment. So what do you say to people who are just now discovering women's basketball because of you? A safe question. An easy one. Most athletes would use that moment to talk about growing the game, inspiring young players, and how grateful they are for the attention. Clark paused. Just for a second. Then she leaned slightly toward the microphone, her expression calm but noticeably more serious than before. Why do people only respect women's basketball, she asked quietly, when it threatens men's comfort? For a moment, nobody spoke. The host looked surprised. Not offended, just caught off guard by the direction the conversation had suddenly taken. The kind of silence that happens when a carefully planned segment takes a turn no one predicted. Clark kept going. She talked about the constant jokes that appear under women's highlights online. The way elite performances are often treated like novelty clips instead of real competition. The way players who dedicate their entire lives to the sport still hear that their achievements somehow don't count in the same way. Her voice never raised. She didn't sound angry. If anything, she sounded tired of pretending the conversation didn't exist. Then she said the sentence that would end up everywhere within hours. If some NBA players actually watched us hoop, they'd stop pretending they're above us. It wasn't delivered like an attack. It sounded more like a simple observation. But the effect was immediate. Clips of the interview hit social media almost instantly. First a few posts from sports accounts. Then larger platforms began sharing the video. Within minutes, it spread across every corner of the internet where basketball fans gathered. The reactions started piling up. Some fans applauded her honesty, saying she had finally said what many women in sports had been thinking for years. Others argued that comparing the leagues would only make the debate worse. But the most interesting reactions came from a different group entirely. NBA players. Because the moment that clip started circulating, phones began lighting up inside locker rooms across the country. Group chats filled with screenshots. Players tagging each other. Agents texting their clients asking if they had seen the clip yet. Some laughed it off. Others didn't. And within a few hours, the basketball world realized something important. Caitlin Clark hadn't just made a statement. She had started a conversation that nobody in the sport could ignore anymore. The first reactions didn't come from press conferences or official statements. They came from phones. Inside locker rooms, on team buses, in private group chats where NBA players spend most of their downtime sharing highlights, jokes, and random clips from around the basketball world. The moment Caitlin Clark's interview started circulating, it landed in those chats almost instantly. At first, the reactions were exactly what you'd expect. A few laughing emojis. A couple of "here we go again" comments. Some players brushed it off like it was just another viral sports debate that would fade away in a day or two. After all, the internet starts new arguments every morning. Most of them disappear just as quickly. But this one didn't disappear. It kept growing. Within hours, sports shows were replaying Clark's quote on loop. Debate panels were suddenly asking the same question from 10 different angles. Was she right? Were NBA players disrespecting women's basketball? Or was the entire conversation being blown out of proportion? And that's when NBA players began responding publicly. The first reaction came from a podcast hosted by two active players who were known for speaking their minds online. They played the clip of Clark's interview during their show, let it run for a few seconds, and then both hosts started laughing. One of them leaned into the microphone and shook his head. "Look," he said, trying to sound calm but clearly amused. "She's good. Nobody's denying that. But let's not pretend she's out here dropping those shots against NBA defenders." The other host chimed in quickly. "Exactly. People online act like she could guard somebody in this league. Come on now." The moment aired. And just like that, the internet exploded again. Not because the comments were particularly shocking. Those kinds of comparisons had been floating around for months, but because this time they were coming directly from NBA players reacting to Clark's challenge. Fans clipped the segment and posted it everywhere. Some defended the players, saying they were simply pointing out the obvious differences between men's and women's basketball. Others accused them of missing Clark's point entirely. The argument spread across every social platform. Meanwhile, inside the league, the reaction wasn't nearly as unified as people expected. Because while some players were laughing about the situation, others were watching the conversation unfold with a completely different reaction. A respected NBA veteran, someone with championship rings and a reputation for speaking thoughtfully about the game, decided to post something on social media. His message was short. "If you feel threatened by Caitlin Clark," he wrote, "maybe she's not the problem." That tweet hit the internet like gasoline on an already burning fire. Within minutes, it had tens of thousands of likes. Fans began sharing it across platforms, praising the veteran for defending women's basketball while also calling out the insecurity behind some of the criticism. Suddenly, the narrative shifted again. Now the conversation wasn't just about Clark versus the NBA. It was about the NBA arguing with itself. Some players quietly deleted earlier comments they had made joking about women's basketball. Others posted vague tweets with eye emojis or cryptic messages that avoided directly mentioning Clark but clearly referenced the ongoing debate. But not everyone decided to stay quiet. One young all-star, known for his confidence both on the court and online, decided he had something to say. Instead of a podcast or interview, he chose Twitter. He quote-tweeted the clip of Clark's interview and added a single sentence. "She better relax before someone invites her to an open gym and reality hits." It was meant to sound like a challenge. A reminder that the NBA was still the highest level of basketball in the world. But the response didn't go the way he expected. Within minutes, the replies filled with thousands of reactions. WNBA players jumped into the conversation first. Some posted laughing emojis. Others pointed out that many women already train and scrimmage with male players during the off-season. Fans followed right behind them. "You average 12 points a game," one reply read. "You're talking loud for somebody who comes off the bench," another wrote. The internet, as usual, had no mercy. And just when the debate felt like it couldn't get any louder, something unexpected happened that pushed the entire situation into a completely different direction. Because suddenly, people started posting stories about something most fans had never heard about before: private runs. And according to those stories, Caitlin Clark had already been there. The internet has a strange habit of digging up stories the moment a debate gets big enough. At first, the comments about private runs sounded like typical online rumors. Fans often claim their favorite player dominated some secret scrimmage or embarrassed someone in an off-season workout. Most of the time, those stories disappear as quickly as they appear. But this time, the conversation didn't fade. It kept growing. Under the All-Stars tweet challenging Clark to an open gym, people began posting something different from opinions. They were posting memories. Stories from trainers, assistant coaches, and players who had quietly crossed paths with Clark during off-season training sessions. According to several of them, Clark had spent plenty of time in gyms where the competition wasn't separated by gender. Summer workouts, closed scrimmages, private runs where professional players drop in to stay sharp during the off-season. The kind of places where reputations spread quietly through word of mouth instead of highlight clips. One former trainer wrote in a thread that quickly started trending. "Y'all arguing like she's never played against men before. She's been running with guys since high school." Another reply came from a former college player who had attended one of those workouts. "She doesn't care who's guarding her. If she sees daylight, she's pulling." Soon the stories started sounding oddly consistent. Clark stepping into pickup games with experienced male players. Clark launching deep shots without hesitation. Clark talking trash the same way competitors do when the game gets intense. None of the stories claimed she dominated professional players. Nobody serious was pretending that a WNBA guard would suddenly become the best player in an NBA gym. But that wasn't the point. The point was something simpler. She belonged in those runs. She wasn't intimidated by them. She wasn't shrinking from the competition. According to several people who had shared the court with her, she played exactly the same way she always played. Confident, aggressive, and completely comfortable taking shots most players wouldn't even attempt. Then another twist appeared. A former NBA teammate of the All-Star who had challenged Clark online decided to post a message of his own. His tweet was only one sentence long. "She's not scared of any of y'all. Some of you refused to guard her in runs." That was the moment the internet truly lost its mind. Because now the conversation had flipped entirely. What began as NBA players dismissing Clark suddenly turned into fans asking a different question. If she had already played in those gyms, what actually happened there? People began searching for footage. Old summer league clips. Training videos. Anything that might show Clark sharing a court with male players. Most of the videos were harmless practice footage. Nothing dramatic enough to prove or disprove anything. But that didn't stop the speculation. And speculation online spreads like wildfire. Comment sections filled with arguments. Some fans insisted the stories were exaggerated. Others believed them completely. The debate became less about whether Clark could compete and more about why certain players seemed so uncomfortable with the possibility. Meanwhile, Clark stayed silent. She didn't respond to the stories. She didn't confirm them. She didn't deny them. Instead, she did what she had been doing all along. She kept playing basketball. But as the internet kept arguing about pickup games and gym stories, something else was quietly happening behind the scenes. The conversation had grown so big that it was no longer just a social media debate. Executives inside sports media companies had started paying attention. Because whenever millions of fans start arguing about one topic at the same time, television networks see something else entirely. Opportunity. And that's when the idea that nobody expected started floating around. What if the debate didn't stay online? What if it moved onto a basketball court where the entire world could watch? Once the debate reached a certain size, it stopped being just another internet argument. It became content. Sports networks started noticing how every segment mentioning Caitlin Clark was outperforming their usual programming. Clips discussing the controversy were pulling massive engagement online. Comment sections filled up instantly. Podcasts that normally struggled to trend suddenly found themselves at the top of sports charts simply for asking one question. Was Caitlin Clark right? Producers began paying attention to something very simple. Whenever Clark's name appeared next to the NBA in a headline, people clicked. And when people click, the entire sports media machine starts spinning. Behind the scenes, producers started floating ideas during editorial meetings. At first they sounded like jokes. Someone would say, "Imagine if we actually put this debate on a court." Everyone in the room would laugh, then move on to the next topic. But eventually the joke stopped sounding so unrealistic, because fans had already started asking for it. A viral petition began circulating online calling for a nationally televised shooting competition between NBA players and Caitlin Clark. Nothing extreme. Just a simple contest. Long-range shooting. Maybe a three-point challenge style format. Within hours, the petition gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Then hundreds of thousands. Fans weren't asking for a full game between leagues. They weren't asking Clark to guard professional men for 40 minutes. They were asking for something far simpler. A direct comparison in the one area where Clark had built her reputation. Shooting. And the idea spread fast. Sports talk shows began discussing it like a hypothetical event that could actually happen. Analysts debated who the NBA should send if the challenge ever became real. Some argued it would be fun entertainment. Others warned it might embarrass players if things didn't go as expected. But the most interesting reactions weren't coming from television. They were coming quietly from inside the league. Because according to a few reporters with strong connections around the NBA, the topic had already reached players themselves. Some had been asked privately whether they would participate if a co-ed shooting showcase were organized during an all-star weekend or off-season event. The responses were cautious. A few players liked the idea. They thought it could be good for the sport and bring attention to women's basketball in a positive way. Others were less enthusiastic. Not because they thought Clark wasn't talented, but because they understood exactly what would happen if the contest went wrong. If an NBA player lost, the internet would never let them forget it. Memes would spread instantly. Clips would replay forever. Comment sections would turn brutal. And in a league where reputations matter almost as much as performance, nobody wanted to become the first player who lost a nationally televised contest against the most famous woman in basketball. For the first time since Clark's interview aired, the conversation had shifted again. Now the debate wasn't just about respect. It was about risk. Meanwhile, fans watching this entire story unfold were becoming more invested by the day. Every new reaction, every rumor, every podcast debate only made people more curious about what might happen next. And honestly, if you're watching this story right now, you're probably just as curious as everyone else following it. Stories like this rarely unfold in real time. And if you enjoy deep dives into moments that shake the sports world like this one, it's worth sticking around because there's a lot more still unfolding. But the situation inside the basketball world was getting stranger. Because while fans were getting excited about the possibility of a public showdown, insiders started hearing something very different from behind the scenes. Some NBA players weren't just hesitant. They were nervous. And then one comment from a legendary superstar changed the tone of the entire debate overnight. For a few days, the entire basketball world sat inside a strange kind of suspense. Every sports show was discussing Caitlin Clark's comments. Fans were debating non-stop online. Players were reacting in bits and pieces through podcasts, tweets, and interviews. But something was still missing. No true heavyweight in the NBA had stepped into the conversation yet. And in a league where certain voices carry more gravity than others, everyone knew that eventually one of those voices would have to respond. The moment came during a routine post-game interview. The game itself had already ended. Reporters gathered around the locker room entrance like they always do, microphones out, cameras rolling, waiting for a few final questions before players left the arena. Normally these interviews revolve around the same predictable topics: game strategy, missed shots, defensive adjustments. But this time, one reporter asked something different. Have you seen Caitlin Clark's comments about NBA players? The room got noticeably quieter. The player being interviewed wasn't just another starter or role player. He was one of the most respected veterans in basketball. A future Hall of Famer. Someone whose words could shape conversations across the entire sport. He paused for a moment, clearly thinking about how to respond. Then he said something that instantly flipped the entire narrative. She's not wrong. Just 3 words. But the effect was immediate. Reporters began typing furiously into their phones. Cameras shifted closer. Everyone in the room suddenly realized the interview had turned into something far more important than a simple post-game conversation. The superstar continued speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Look," he said, "some guys are uncomfortable because they don't really watch women's basketball. If they did, they'd know there's elite talent there." He didn't say Clark could dominate the NBA. He didn't challenge his own league. But he acknowledged something that many fans had been arguing about for days. Respect. And coming from someone with championship rings, MVP awards, and one of the most recognizable names in the sport, that acknowledgement carried enormous weight. The clip spread across the internet almost as fast as Clark's original interview. Suddenly, the debate shifted again. Now the conversation wasn't framed as Clark versus the NBA. It became something more complicated. Some of the most influential figures in basketball were beginning to defend the idea that women's basketball deserved more serious attention. Fans celebrated the comment immediately. Women's basketball players shared the clip across social media. Analysts praised the superstar for showing leadership in a conversation that had started turning ugly online. Even some NBA players who had stayed silent earlier began posting supportive messages about the growth of the women's game. But while the public reaction seemed overwhelmingly positive, the response inside certain corners of the league was more complicated. Because the moment a superstar validates a controversial statement, it becomes much harder for critics to keep dismissing it. And that's exactly what was happening. Players who had joked about Clark earlier suddenly stopped mentioning her name. Some quietly deleted tweets that had aged poorly during the debate. Others avoided the topic entirely when reporters tried to bring it up during interviews. It wasn't that the entire NBA had suddenly changed its opinion. It was that the conversation had grown too big to control. Meanwhile, Clark herself had remained almost completely silent throughout the chaos. No long threads on social media. No interviews explaining her comments. No attempts to escalate the situation. For nearly 2 days after the superstar's remarks spread across the internet, she said nothing at all. And strangely, that silence only made the story bigger. Because everyone began waiting for the same thing. Her response. Would she double down on her original statement? Would she walk it back now that the debate had become so massive? Or would she say something that pushed the entire conversation even further? Eventually, she posted just one sentence. And it instantly became one of the most shared messages in basketball that week. "I'm not here to be liked," Clark wrote. "I'm here to compete." The message appeared without warning. No long explanation. No follow-up thread. No dramatic build-up. Just one short post. "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to compete." 10 words. And somehow those 10 words carried more weight than hours of debate across sports television. Within minutes, the internet exploded again. Screenshots of the post spread through Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, and every sports forum where fans had been arguing for days. Comment sections filled with reactions almost instantly. Some people called it the perfect response. Others called it cold. A few critics insisted she was fueling the drama. But most fans saw it for what it was. Confidence. Clark wasn't apologizing. She wasn't escalating the conflict either. She simply restated something every great athlete understands at the highest level of competition. Respect in sports is rarely given freely. It's earned. And the moment her message spread across social media, the conversation around the entire situation shifted once again. Suddenly, the debate wasn't just about comparisons between leagues anymore. It was about something deeper that fans had begun recognizing throughout the entire story. For years, women's basketball had been fighting for visibility. For years, incredible players had delivered elite performances that often received only a fraction of the attention given to men's leagues. But Caitlin Clark arrived at a moment when the audience was finally ready to pay attention. Her deep shooting range made highlights go viral. Her fearless style made casual viewers curious. And her willingness to speak honestly about respect turned a simple interview into a cultural flashpoint. What started as one comment during a television segment had grown into something far bigger than anyone expected. NBA players debating each other. Fans demanding mixed shooting competitions. Sports networks scrambling to keep up with a story that refused to slow down. And through all of it, Clark kept doing the same thing she had been doing since the beginning. Playing basketball. That might be the most fascinating part of the entire situation. While analysts, podcasts, and social media users continued arguing about her comments, Clark never turned the moment into a personal feud. She didn't call out specific players. She didn't challenge anyone to a public showdown. She simply made one point clear. Women's basketball deserves respect. Not as a comparison. Not as a novelty. But as elite competition in its own right. And now the basketball world is watching what happens next. Because moments like this rarely disappear overnight. Conversations about respect, visibility, and competition tend to grow once they reach this level of attention. Fans keep talking. Media keeps covering it. Players keep reacting. Which means the next chapter of this story might already be forming somewhere behind the scenes. Maybe it's that shooting showcase fans keep demanding. Maybe it's another interview that pushes the conversation even further. Or maybe it's something nobody expects yet. What's certain is this: Caitlin Clark didn't just spark a debate. She forced the basketball world to look at itself. And once a conversation like that begins, it rarely stops. So now the real question is yours. Do you think Caitlin Clark was right to call out the disrespect around women's basketball? Or do you think the entire controversy was blown out of proportion? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this debate clearly isn't going away anytime soon. And if you enjoy stories that break down the moments shaking the sports world right now, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more fans discover these conversations, and it keeps you updated when the next major story hits the basketball world. Because something tells me this isn't the last time Caitlin Clark changes the conversation.